And we're live, Chris.
Oh, hey, are we? Oh, really? Really? I'm so
Oh,
sorry, Rick.
yeah, there you
Yeah,
go. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am in fact in London. Yes, and you?
Uh,
And Rick, it looks like you're in Chicago.
I am in Chicago. Welcome, everybody, to
Good.
History Happy Hour.
Yeah.
We're glad to see you here. Brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of what?
Of historical tours.
Historical tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. Check it out at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And listen, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Today,
Yes.
we will be talking about World War One and how
Yes.
close the Germans really came to winning it. Let us know you're here and what you're drinking. So that keep us informed of how you're doing. And while you're doing that, we want to let everybody who supports us on Patreon know how much we appreciate that. And you too can support us on Patreon. Maybe you want to become a top shelf patron and get your name on this semi-permanent digital display, which you can do by becoming a patron at patreon.com/history
Very
happy
happy
hour.
hour. Yeah.
Chris, I think yeah, is there anybody out there watching,
There
Chris,
are.
or are we just here by ourselves?
No, no. Susan Yu has joined us again, and Catherine Meyer Hurst, Ted Moon, Gene Templin, Doug McCord, Xavier, of course, has joined us twice.
Wally
So,
Morrison, Stephen
yeah.
Dean, Jim Stark, Frank, and Xavier's dog is also watching. So that does make it a particularly important show for us
Oh yeah,
all,
Xavier.
I would expect. All right, Chris. Well, have we used up enough time here? Have we
I think we have,
we
yes,
we
faffed
are
about long enough.
we're ready to go. We're ready to roll into the world. So give me a cue, and we'll get the open going, and we'll get to our guest.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Chris, what's on tap today?
Yeah, we have a really interesting new book, or relatively new, about on a knife edge, and it's kind of takes a new look at the First World War and just how close it came. And the author is Holger Afflerbach, who is a professor of modern European history at the University of Leeds. He's written a lot, but his most notable books are a biography of Erich von Falkenhayn, and a study of the Triple Alliance during the Great War. But we're here to discuss On a Knife Edge this week, and so we want to thank him for joining us.
Holger,
Professor
thank you so
Afflerbach, thanks
much for
for
being
coming us.
here.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So I got to know about your book, as we mentioned before the show, at a lecture that you gave at the National Army Museum here in London, and I attend lots of lectures there. I have an interest in the Great War, and when I saw the title of the book, I thought that this was going to be another kind of introduction to the history of the Great War, but from the German perspective. And I was wrong. There's so much more to your book than that. I mean, that's obviously a big part of it, but you go into so many other facets of the war, and you give a really fresh look at the war. But kind of just to get started here, what was it that you saw in the historiography of the Great War that you said, something's missing here, and I need to fill a hole? What was the hole that needed filling that kind of led to On a Knife Edge?
Yeah, this is now already, jumping into it, deep into it. Um,
I didn't mean to. Sorry.
yes. What made me write this book? What was the urge? And I think the urge was that if we speak about the First World War, then Germany, Imperial Germany, is shown as a kind of imperialistic machine, and that there's a very big unity in Imperial Germany to win the war and to commit all kind of heinous crimes to get there. And despite the fact that there are a lot of very, very bad and critical points in the history of Imperial Germany during the First World, the real story is is in vast parts, not completely, in vast parts, a different one. And it is less a story of an imperialist machine who wants to win the war, and where some people, like, for example, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, are at the helm and nobody has anything to say. So that is basically some of the ideas which we have about the First World War and about Imperial Germany. And I thought this is partially wrong. And get me right, partially means partially and not completely wrong, partially wrong. And this is even more difficult to fight than a completely wrong picture. So that you say, I have basically to get it right. And that made me do it. And I have also to say, it did not come out of the blue, because I have written my PhD on Erich von Falkenhayn, which is for our British audience a figure like Haig, so like a British historian working on Haig. And I have edited sources on Wilhelm II in the First World War on a day-by-day basis. And for that reason, I had a very, very proper preparation for writing a comprehensive book on the First World War. That of course matters as well. If you have a life as a scholar and you amass a lot of material and views, then at some point you can do it, or you should do it.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes the listening to the voice that says we should do something is it's important to hear. As a kind of a baseline to this discussion, you're teaching at the University of Leeds, but you're from Germany. How is World War I viewed in Germany today? I don't have a very good idea if it's even thought about much, or is it, what the kind of point of view is toward World War I, and to what degree is that point of view off the mark, wrong, that it needs correcting?
Well, if we consider Germany, in Germany, the First World War was for a quite long time overshadowed by the Second World War, by National Socialism, by the Second World War, by the Holocaust. And I would say to some extent that is even true today, despite the fact that people are in Germany now slightly tired about that, because it's overdone and there's a lot of repetition regarding the Second World War, Hitler and so on. Regarding the First World War, it's now, we have to be honest. It's history. It's now more than 100 years ago. I recall the moment when there was in the newspapers that the last veteran of the First World War died. I think it was a person in Australia. So and that is now, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. So the First World War is history in the sense that everybody who lived in this period is dead. And this makes it also possible to speak about that without the passions which the people who lived in this war and who suffered in this war had to go through. So this is, of course, another thing I can lean back as a historian, and it is a history which you still can be passionate about, but it is a different thing than be passionate because it is linked with your personal suffering or wrongdoing, even worse. And in Germany, the First World War is history, and it is also a history which is dominated basically by I don't know now, you interrupt me if I'm speaking about things which are not common knowledge. There is a famous Fischer debate in Germany, which is linked to the work of the Hamburg historian Fritz Fischer, who published in 1961 a book on Germany's war aims in the First World War, in which he claimed that Germany was not fighting a war of self-defense, but a war of aggression. And that caused a very big debate, which went on for more than 10 years and was extremely bitter on both sides. So bitter that some historians tried to forbid Fritz Fischer to travel abroad to teach about German history and his ideas. And it was very bitter because the people who were involved in this debate were fighting the First World War partially themselves. One example is the most important opponent of Fritz Fischer was a historian called Gerhard Ritter. And Gerhard Ritter was an officer in the First World War. And this is exactly what I mean. For him, the First World War was not only a history of passion, but it was also his history. He lived through that and he fought on the Western Front. And this makes a heck of a difference.
Yeah.
But did that answer your question, or are we basically floating away?
Well, we're floating a little bit, but Chris, go ahead. You jump in.
No. So you say in the introduction, Professor, you say that the idea that Germany was simply doomed from the beginning to lose the First World War is itself unhistorical and ignores the fact that the outcome of the war was for a long time very much on a knife edge. So, what do you mean? We'll get into it as we go along, but what kind of do you mean by that? How close was it, and is...
Yes. Okay. So that is a concrete question, and now I will stick to it.
Okay.
And was the First World War close? I think the title On the Knife Edge suggests that, and I really think it was. It was differently from some people who reviewed my books thought that I make the claim that Germany had a realistic chance of winning it. That is not true. Everybody who reads my book will learn that I'm of the opinion that Germany had no real chance of winning it. Because, the only imaginable way would be that the Schlieffen Plan works out despite the fact that it had a lot of problems.
Right.
Maybe then. But I say Germany had no chance of winning. But in Europe, we had a stalemate. And for that reason, if Germany had not committed serious mistakes, the stalemate would have gone on and on and on. And at some point, it would have forced both parties to make a piece of compromise.
Right.
That is what I say in the book. And it is also I think it is absolutely evident that we had a stalemate because you have to look towards how the First World War was evolving over from 1914 to 1918. It was basically, it ran aground, and then they tried did they try to make breakthroughs? Did they try to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible? Did they try both at the same time? But whatever they did, it did not work. And this would have continued. I don't know for how long, because it is counterfactual history. And the only thing which at the end decided the war was that the Americans entered. And this is now, everybody would agree on that. I think this is also very basic and very common knowledge. The Americans intervened, and in November 1918, we had 2 million American soldiers in France. 2 million. And these 2 million American soldiers made the difference. The problem was the Americans were brought in because Germany declared the unlimited submarine warfare on the 1st of February 1917. They did not have to do that, right?
Right.
So, and if they hadn't, this is now counterfactual, but counterfactual history made by Winston Churchill. So he said the First World War was actually hanging in the balance, and 6 weeks decided over losing or winning. And the 6 weeks were the period between the declaration of the unlimited submarine warfare on the 1st of February 1917 and the outbreak of the First Russian Revolution in March 1917, which showed that probably Russia sooner than later will drop out. And with Russia dropping out, Britain, France, and Italy would have had the task to fight against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria alone. And this would have meant that would have gone on forever. Forever. And of course, bringing Europe down. But this is another story.
So in essence, I'm sorry.
No, okay.
Yeah, no. In essence, you're saying that that the decision to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare is essentially the moment that Germany, by its own actions, makes it impossible to win the war, or makes it impossible for it to stalemate the war, to come to a draw. And history tells us this really clearly, looking at it now, as you write. Why does it look so different then? Why do they think that this is how we're going to win the war, and it turns out to be how we're going to lose the war?
What you mean? Why they declared the unlimited submarine?
Yeah, why did they think that was going to be the thing that was going to power them to victory? I mean, if they'd waited, as you say, and Russia had collapsed, they might have said, "Yeah, we'll wait a little longer, see what happens." But they didn't wait. So why did they make that decision?
Well, the story, to answer this question, we have to take now another fact of the First World War into consideration. And this is now a very strange fact. The strange fact is that the Central Powers were winning on the battlefield and losing on the home front. So they, whatever the Entente powers did militarily, it did not work out. And the Central Powers were performing much better on the battlefield, and they were deep in enemy territory wherever you look. And the home front issue was a different one. And in the winter 1916, 1917, Germany had the so-called turnip winter, we'll say an extreme shortage of food, which was caused by poor harvest. So German productivity, not only in agriculture, but generally because of the war and because of the lack of labor, was dropping during the war. So the First World War was also an economic crisis, and the European powers were not very able in coping with these problems. And probably this is also a problem which you cannot solve if an army, if a nation like Germany drafts over the war more than 10 million people. These 10 million people were missing at home, and you cannot produce the same stuff, for example, food stuff, like in peacetime, especially if you wage war against the former producers of your food stuff which you imported. So basically in late 1916 there was a food crisis in Germany, and at the same time the German High Command made a peace offer, discussing it with the Austrians, with the Bulgarians, and with the Turks, and the Central Powers made in December 1916 a peace offer. And the peace offer was basically asking the Allied powers to finally start peace talks. And the peace offer was serious. It was not made only for show, but they really wanted, if humanly possible, to start talking about peace with the enemies. And the war party in Germany, we'll say the Hindenburg-Ludendorff, said, okay, you can make the peace offer, fine, but the enemy will probably not react on that. And if the enemy does not react on that, we have to use everything we can to force the enemy to accept finally peace. Because if they reject the peace offer, it shows that they don't want to negotiate. The peace offer was rejected. And then the second leg would say, then we have to use everything we have, and the Navy promised miraculous successes with submarines. And now you can say, why did they do it? Because did they not see that they bring the Americans in? The answer for that is that they saw that they probably will bring the Americans in, but they said the Americans are already delivering all the war materials which our enemies need to confront us in northern France. So the Americans deliver all the materials Britain, France, and Italy need to continue the war, and we cannot stop that. And we have now to look that they deliver all the war material without doing nothing. This was basically the argument. And they said, well, the Americans are already kind of not really neutral, because if you deliver weapons to your enemies, you are not neutral. And that was a reason that they declared the unlimited submarine warfare, and also because they thought the Americans will not, and this was now the major mistake, they thought the Americans will not engage fully. They will send maybe 200,000 volunteers, and that's it. They did not think that the Americans will go away from George Washington's idea not to mix into European affairs and so on, and that they will massively getting engaged in Europe. And we have to be fair, even Woodrow Wilson in early 1917 did not think that the Americans will actively sent more than a few 100,000 volunteers. They did by then not think about the drafted army of several million men. We'll say the Germans committed a catastrophic mistake, but we can reconstruct how they did that.
So one of the perceptions that I think we have about the war is that, Germany is this monolithic state, and it's governed by the Kaiser, who's almost an absolute monarch, and he makes all the decisions. And that, they're marching under this plan at his direction. You paint a very different picture of German society and how Germany is run. So I guess using the Kaiser as an example, could you talk about him and his place in all of this, and really maybe you talk about factionalism within German society, maybe paint the picture of the country before the war and the Kaiser's place in it?
Mm-hmm. So that is also a very good point, that Wilhelm II was not this absolute dominant figure which the propaganda made him. But I think even already before the war, everybody, a lot of people knew that already, because Wilhelm II's reign started in 1888. Mm-hmm. And so he had in 1918 30 years of being ruler in Germany. So people knew how he was. And I myself use indeed an idea which was used by a German social historian. His name is Hans Ulrich Wehler. He's unfortunately dead, but he was a great German social historian. And he said Imperial Germany's political system is not a kind of hierarchy that you have on the top one figure and it goes top down, and there's a very powerful person at the helm, but it is a center of decision centers, so several power poles which are competing for making a decision. And the German system was cumbersome. That is also something which, for example, Lloyd George said. The German system is extremely cumbersome. And even in the time, people knew that this was the case. And because it was cumbersome, it was also very difficult to make clear decisions. And because it was cumbersome, it was also not the case that Germany was during the First World War a pure military dictatorship. That is basically what many people say, that, okay, the Reichstag wanted peace and the politicians wanted peace, but at the end there was Ludendorff, and Ludendorff wanted victory. True, Ludendorff wanted victory, and Ludendorff was a powerful figure. No question about that. But Ludendorff could not decide that alone. Ludendorff was one power pole in a very complicated package and had to fight against others. And that is also another argument of my book, that I say that the German Peace Party, basically the parts of the German society who wanted peace during the First World War, and there was a considerable peace party, they had the big disadvantage that they did not get any help from abroad. We'll say a peace party needs a positive signal from the other side.
Right.
Because otherwise, the war party at home will say, well, you are an idealistical idiot. You don't understand how the enemy works. The enemy understands only one question, and this is violence. We have to win, and winning is the only way of getting out of the war. And this was what the German war party said. You are living in illusions if you think that you can compromise with the enemy. The enemy wants to fight it through. And this was the argument which Ludendorff used in all these internal debates. And he could, for example, then, if people said, well, it's not that bad and so on, he could say, look, for example, Lloyd George and his interview, this fight has to go on to a finish, to a knockout, for example. And immediately you have a proof. And not offering more incentives to the German Peace Party and giving them more opportunity to to basically control things in Germany was also a tragedy, I would say.
Yeah.
A tragedy and a mistake from the other side not to join them or to help them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But they did not help them because they distrusted them, of course. It's also a complicated question. And that, if I may add that, then I stop talking. One of the topics of my book is, of course, the book is on the First World War, and I don't pretend that I'm speaking about anything else. But at the end of the day, I'm speaking also, how can you end a war? A big war of coalition, a big war where millions of soldiers are involved. Is it possible to get out of this kind of war with a kind of compromise, or do you have to fight that out?
Right.
That is a question. This is a real question of the book.
Right.
So I want to remind everybody that we're chatting with... that's the wrong book. All right, we'll try the right book here. With Holger Afflerbach, author of On a Knife Edge. We should probably bring in some of the questions that our audience has been putting up here. And one of the first ones, you referred to the decision to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare as kind of being a pivotal decision because it helped to make America part of the war, bring America into the war. And one of our viewers, Wally Morrison, says, well, what about the German-Mexican connection as a cause of the U.S. involvement in the war? Is that less important than we think it is? Is it only important because now with the submarine warfare there's a higher interest, or what's the relationship there?
You mean, did I get that right? The Mexican
Right,
connection.
right.
So
So
basically, that he is alluding
to
the
the
question is
Zimmerman
alluding to the
telegram.
Zimmerman telegram, of
Right.
Yeah.
course. Well, very good point. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, true. But we have to make that the sequence in which these decisions were made. First sequence is that they decided in January 1917 to return to the unlimited submarine warfare.
Okay.
Which I did not mention so far was that we had unlimited submarine warfare already in 1915,
Right.
which was then stopped after harsh American protest after the sinking of the Lusitania. It was stopped in early autumn 1915 and suspended, and they did not do it. So the first decision was making the unlimited submarine warfare, 1st of February 1917. Then second point, which I have to mention, which makes this period, which is probably the cornerstone of my book, even more tragic from a German point of view, because President Woodrow Wilson had made a peace initiative in late 1916 and after winning the American presidential elections. And in early 1917, he tried to broker peace in Europe. And all that was massively interrupted by the declaration of unlimited submarine warfare. And then the Americans severed diplomatic relations. But please keep in mind, the Americans entered the war in early April 1917, and the declaration of unlimited submarine warfare was on the 1st of February. So you can ask, what did they do in the meantime? Why did they not declare war on the 3rd or 4th or 5th of February? So they were basically probably waiting because President Woodrow Wilson was not really a big fan of entering the war. That was not true. And probably he needed time. And then the British Secret Service had tapped the German telegram to offer Mexico, the US states like Arizona and New Mexico, if they entered the war against the US. So if the Americans enter the war, then if you enter the war, we will help you to reconquer. So, and the British Secret Service made that then public. I would say that probably that was then too much. And then the American declaration of war came, and it was also unanimously decided. And we have also to keep in mind, if I say the Americans did not do it lightly, the United States of America had around 90 million inhabitants, but then and at least 10 million were so-called German-Americans, German Americans. So they had an enormous German, I will not say a German minority, but they had a big group of people with German roots. And so they were also kind of uncertain about the loyalty of this group. And but even the German Americans could not do anything about this extremely stupid move of the Zimmerman telegram, which showed that the German government was definitely using foul play. Does that answer the question more or less?
Yeah, I think so. Chris?
Yeah. So over what does, if if the idea that Germany had this master plan to dominate Europe and they went to war to be hegemon in Europe, if that's not really the case, what is it that what is victory for Germany? I mean, why? What are they? What are their war aims, and what does victory look like for them when they do go to war?
Okay, so that is, Chris, thank you very much for asking that. This is a very important point because my take on that, and I have now to say I'm one historian and I have a certain idea of how this history went, and there are other historians who have different ideas. I have to say that only to be fair. But my take on why Germany entered the war in 1914 was that a diplomatic maneuver derailed and got completely out of hand. We'll say, I spare you now the details because otherwise we'll talk about the July crisis and helping Austria and why, and is it a repetition of the Bosnian crisis? Let's say it was a headline. The headline is they make a risky move and they say this can backfire, but they at the end of the day they think it will not, so that they gamble for diplomatic success, and the diplomatic success is to strengthen the last reliable ally Germany had in Europe, will say Austria-Hungary, to strengthen the Austrians. And that backfires, and then they have a European war to fight. And the point is that they have no real idea for an aggressive war. If it were a long-planned war for aggression, for example, that Imperial Germany premeditated on conquering Europe or something like that, they should have done it differently. And there are some historians who even try to find that, like Fritz Fischer, who say that since 1912 they prepared that. I don't think so, and the majority of all historians doesn't think it either. So basically a diplomatic maneuver derailed, and then they had to go to war. And then they had to think about what kind of sense does that make. Right. But this is basically putting the sense after you do it. Right. And this is what I say about this chaotic structures. You try to invent sense for that, and then they come, because for a moment they think they have won the war. In the West, they come with the September program, so establishing German dominance in Central Europe. And then they run aground, and the September program gets shelved because it is irrelevant. And then they hang around, and then from November 1914 onwards, they start to reflect on a political way out of the war. And then from November 1914 to December 1916, they try with secret diplomacy to find a way out. All that does not work. And then in December 1916, they make an official peace offer. This does not work either. And this is the story of one of the stories of the book. This is bloody difficult to get out of a world war, even if you want to. And especially if you want to and you have conditions of your own. Because now you can ask, if I say, okay, they don't want to conquer Europe, what is the other condition of Imperial Germany to get out of the war? And I would say from 1916 onwards, when the situation in Germany becomes very dire because of the food situation and social situation, then probably if they had got a status quo peace, we'll say we get out of the war exactly the way we came in, they would have accepted that. This is now a stretch, and some historians would say Afflerbach is crazy to claim that, but I could bring you now evidence, quotes from Ludendorff, and quotes from many other people, quotes from Erich von Falkenhayn, who said, if we don't lose this war, we have won it. So basically that they said, we have only to hold our ground, this is enough.
Yeah. So one of the things that we haven't really yet quite dealt with is the Russian armistice with Germany in 1917, and then which leads to a full peace treaty in early 1918,
Yeah.
which allows the Germans to ship hundreds of thousands of troops, I assume, to the West. And the thing that I've always wondered from before reading your book, and still wonder, why doesn't this open the way to ending the war before the Americans can get fully involved and fully fighting? I mean, the German troops that are there at the Russian border are a whole lot closer than the American troops that are in Michigan and Minnesota and Kansas. So why can't Germany put their troops in and then launch the offensive that will just to end all offensives and kind of put an end to the war before America even arrives?
Well, the short answer is because they couldn't. Because this is what they
Well, this is why Leeds pays you so much money, right? Give us a slightly longer answer.
This is exactly what they tried. They brought the troops to the West, and they were also quite confident that they would be able to do it. And this was not the confidence of Ludendorff. This was a widespread confidence, probably all over public opinion in Germany. They thought, well, now we defeated the strongest enemy which we fought against, we'll say the Russians. The Russians are now beaten. We defeated the Italians in Caporetto because there was this big victory October 1917 on the Italian front, and the Italian army was basically was nearly completely destroyed. And they thought, well, and if we bring now all the troops to the West, we can do the same with the British and the French, and this is the fastest way to victory because the enemy does not want to negotiate. This is the argument of the German war party. They say the enemy does not negotiate, now we have to force them with our military might. And the German offensives, because they made 5 offensives in 1918, I would say to make a long story short, they had no chance. This did not work, and they were even militarily, there were some successes, but it was not good enough. Because what you need to finish the war is a strategic victory. You have to eliminate the enemy on the battlefield, and the German army in 1918 did not have the manpower and especially not the mobility to do it. It was not possible. Militarily, it was not possible.
So one of the things, there's a whole bunch of really fascinating topics. You bring up things that, I hadn't really thought about before, and I'm just going to pick one. There's a bunch in this book that I found really compelling. Could you talk a little bit again about Italy and its role in all this? Because I was amazed by your discussion of Italy and the importance it plays in sort of the course of the war. You don't usually hear this. So could you tell us a little bit about what you discussed about the importance of Italy and Italy's getting involved in the war, just as an example of one of these aha things in your book?
Okay, thank you for bringing that up, because indeed Italy does not get the attention it should get, because there's even this constant tendency on belittling Italy, the least of the great powers. The Italians and militarily, look at them. And the point was that in a coalition warfare, the common strength counts. And the common strength can also count if another great power like Italy puts its weight on the balance, on the European balance And if we consider that we had in Europe a stalemate from autumn 1914 onwards, the European stalemate, stalemate is not, can be broken. And the war ended also because it was broken, because Americans entered, and the stalemate was broken then. But in 1950, we had already a situation where the Russians had a catastrophic defeat in early May 1915. And if the Italians had not entered the war in May 1915 to counterbalance that, then the entire story with Russia would have evolved faster. But the Italians basically made by then good what the Russians had lost, to make now a more complicated argument accessible. And for that reason, the Italians countered in the First World War. They countered also in another way, because once you have a new partner on board, like the Italians, who entered the war because they got promises from the British, the French, and the Russians. So the Italians did not enter for free. They got political promises. And this makes a peace even more complicated, because if a new party enters a war with its own objectives, then to find an end in a coalition warfare, where basically you have not only to negotiate with the enemy, but also with your coalition partners, and every coalition partner wants something different, this becomes a very complicated task. And having Italy on board made, for example, an idea of Lord George to conclude in 1917 a separate peace with Austria-Hungary impossible, because Italians wanted to make their main gains on the expense of Austria-Hungary. And this basically slammed the door. And this is another question about the First World War. It's coalition warfare. And coalition warfare is notoriously difficult to end.
Yeah.
Well, bringing in another question from one of our viewers, William Fisher is writing, and he asks about the battle at Dobropol in northern Macedonia. And he says, the Central Powers' defeat there opened the road to Vienna. Austrians asked Germany for aid. Ludendorff said no, advised the Kaiser to seek an armistice. And then he says, true? So I will ask you that question. Is that a true description of that battle? And was that an important important point in bringing about the end of this war?
The short answer is kind of yes. That we are saying first argument could be we are speaking. I spoke about Italy being a kind of semi-forgotten power of the First World War. Now we speak about Bulgaria and the Bulgarian theater of war.
The actual
Bulgaria
forgotten
entered the
power
war
of
in
the First World War.
1915. And in 1918, there were two things which urged Ludendorff to ask for an armistice. And the two things came at the same moment. The first one was that the Bulgarians could not stop the Allied attack from the bridgehead in Saloniki. They basically broke through, and the Bulgarians had to ask for an armistice. We'll say the Balkan front broke open. And at the same moment on the Western front, the Western Allies were able to pierce the Hindenburg line. It was practically in the same moment, the same weeks, the same days. Two things happened. And probably if only one of the two things have happened, they may have been tempted to try to fix it militarily. But if your fronts on two opposite ends of Europe are basically collapsing, you say, well, the game is up. And this is what Ludendorff said. By the way, Ludendorff said that while, for example, in the Second World War, Hitler never said that. Fronts were collapsing and he was hanging on.
Yeah.
So Ludendorff was a tiny little bit more responsible than Hitler.
So, Holger, you say in the book that the Central Powers are largely responsible for bringing on the war, but the Western powers, the Great Britain, France, etc., are largely responsible for prolonging the war. What do you mean by that? Because you would have thought that they would have been happy to just say, okay, no mas, but you're saying no, they don't. That it's these countries that want to pursue this, and what do you mean by that argument?
Yeah, so I already said several times the Central Powers and also Germany were interested in negotiating a peace, and the Allied powers knew that. They knew that, but they were hesitant because they thought in the long run we will win. And also, we don't want a negotiated peace because right now the Central Powers have militarily the upper hand, and if we conclude peace now, it will be a horse trading. And we don't want to make a horse trading, we will give them our terms. And we have also to say at the end, the Allied were right, they won. So basically, we cannot say that was a completely idiotic assessment. They from the moment the Americans entered the war, they had a realistic chance to win it. With Americans neutral, it would have been a very, very different story. Very, very different story. But everything comes at a price. Even then, for example, I bring in the book an episode that Colonel House, the friend and political advisor of Woodrow Wilson, suggested to end the war with a compromise peace instead of winning against Germany, not for the sake of Germany, but for the sake of Russia. Because Russia, for a few months between March 1917 and the October Revolution, had a kind of liberal government. We know this period ended when the communists took over. And Colonel House in August 1917 suggested to, I say it now with my words, to call it a day to save Russian democracy. And this was not followed up. And many people speak all the time about the First World War and Germany losing and so on. But we could make the claim that the real catastrophic result of the First World War was what happened with Russia. And that Russia dropped out of the normal European state system. And never got in back. And that is indeed a thing which made also post-1918 peace order very difficult. Imagine, for example, Russia had been a completely normal state, and somebody like Hitler would have been kept in check much easier because Russia would have cooperated with Britain and France, right? Yeah. And all that matters. And this is what I would call the collateral damage of victory.
Yeah.
Well, Holger Afflerbach, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your fascinating new book, which is called, can I get the right one up here, On a Knife Edge, How Germany Lost the First World War. And before we do let you completely go, I want to ask you about that room that you're in, because we did have a couple of people ask about the room. Is this a special, room of solitude and quiet at your house, or are you visiting someplace?
I have to admit, I'm right now in a bed and breakfast somewhere in Norfolk, very close to the royal house of Sandringham, which I visited today.
Nice.
Okay. Well, it's a great looking room, and we encourage you to go back anytime you have to do an interview and do it from there. Holger, thank you so much for joining us today.
Fascinating book. I really enjoyed
Oh,
and
thank you very much.
eye-opening stuff.
Chris and Rick, thank you very much, and also to the audience, thank you very much for having me.
It was our
Good.
great pleasure. Thank you.
Good luck.
And Chris, next week,
Yes.
we will talk to the authors of a book called Faces of Margraten. This is I
Yes.
did try to show this earlier.
That header, so.
But we're going to bring on Jori Videk, Sebastian Fonk, and Ariane van Hees to talk about this book, which is about stories of American soldiers buried in the Margraten Cemetery in the Netherlands, and it's a very emotional and moving story. So definitely
It's fascinating.
worth checking in. And then in 2 weeks, it's going to be lessons from our master class,
Lessons.
and lessons with a test at the end. No test.
Lessons or bloopers from the master
Lessons
class.
or bloopers or something vaguely related somehow to the master class. But please, everybody, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.